Hello and welcome back to Sewing and Gaming, where I am currently in the process of making a ball gown version of the outfit Jareth wears in the ballroom scene of Labyrinth. Last time, I made this black skirt, which is the first visible part of the cosplay that I am working on. Next up is the shirt. To make this shirt, I'm using McCall's pattern M8147 version A. And since I'll be needing a collar for this shirt, I'm using the collar piece and instructions from version B. Since I've already made this pattern before, which was for the shirt on my first Goblin King cosplay, the pattern pieces were already cut out of the pattern paper. So I only needed to gather the right pieces, lay them out over my fabric, and cut the pieces out of the fabric. With all the fabric and interfacing pieces cut, I went to the ironing board to iron the interfacing to the fabric facing pieces. Then I cut all the notches and transferred markings to the fabric. Now it's time to move to the sewing machine. The first step is to perform some stay stitching along the neckline of both the back pieces and the front piece. Then the back pieces are sewn together at the back seam, leaving an opening above the marking. The side seams are then sewn together, attaching the front and back pieces. After putting some stay stitches in the neckline of the sleeve pieces, long gather stitches are then sewn along the armhole edges. Before the gather stitches can be pulled and gathered, the underarm seam of the sleeve is pinned and sewn together. Then the sleeves can be attached to the shirt. With the right sides together, I pinned the sleeves to the armhole edges of the front and back pieces, making sure to match up seams, markings, and edges. Then all the gather stitches are pulled so that the fabric of the sleeves can bunch up and gather to fit the width of the armhole opening. The shirt and the sleeves are sewn together at the seam allowance, and then another line of stitching is sewn 1/4 inch away from the seam allowance. Next, I began to fold over the fabric so I could finish the hem of the sleeves. I didn't do the hem exactly how the pattern said to do it, but that's okay with me. While I am using the pattern as a base for my shirt, I am making modifications to it in order to get the look that I'm envisioning for this cosplay. The hem of each of the sleeves ended up being too narrow to get around my sewing machine, so instead of sewing the hem by machine, I hand stitched each hem in place. I tried on the shirt to check the sleeve length, which ended up being too long, so I folded them over again and stitched again at the new hem. Once again, I tried on the shirt, this time to test the fit around my torso and arms. It ended up being too loose and flowy, and while that look was okay for my first cosplay,
it's not what I'm going for this time around. So after taking note of where I wanted to bring the shirt in, I took it off, flipped it inside out, and drew rough lines at each side seam where I wanted to bring the shirt in. Then I pinned along those lines and went to my sewing machine to sew the new seam. Unfortunately, I brought the new seam in too much at the armpits, so I took my seam ripper and removed both of the new seams. Then I drew new lines at the sides, this time making sure to taper off from my new seam line at the edges to the original seam under the armpits. Then I sewed along the new lines. After trying it on again, the shirt fit so much better, so it's time to finally move on to the collar. I took the collar piece, and with the right sides together, folded it in half along the fold line, pinning the edges in place. Then I stitched the ends at each of the short edges. I flipped the collar right side out and went to the ironing board to press the collar flat. Then I pinned and sewed the collar to the neckline of the shirt, making sure to match all of the markings. Next, I grabbed the front and back facing pieces and pinned and stitched them together at the shoulder seams. These seams were then pressed open, and at the same time I folded over and pressed the unnotched edge of the facing. Then I stitched the fold down. Sandwiching the collar between the facing and the shirt, I attached the facing to the shirt at the neckline, making sure to match centers and shoulder seams. Then I opened out the facing and used an understitch to attach it to the seam allowance. The collar ended up being too tall for my taste, so I folded it in half again and used a slip stitch to secure it in place. Then I folded over and finished the raw edges of the fabric at the back opening. Next, I finished the bottom hem of the shirt by folding the fabric over, placing pins as I fold. To make sure the raw edge is concealed, I fold the fabric over again, adjusting pins as I go. When I got to the side seams, I used my scissors to remove the excess fabric after I brought in the side seams earlier. Then, I sew along the first folded line. I grabbed some snaps and got to work sewing them to the back edges of the collar. Then I sewed more hook and eye fasteners along the bottom of the shirt. I didn't originally plan to do this, but since the shirt will tuck into the skirt, I still needed a way to secure the skirt in place so that it won't turn and spin on me while I move throughout the day. To make the ruffled/gathered effect on the collar, I grabbed a spare piece of fabric and, with my shirt on my dress form, set to work hand gathering and pinning the fabric on the collar. Once it was all pinned, I began to hand sew everything in place.
There you have it. The shirt is complete. I'm not a huge fan of how the collar ended up looking when I was done. However, that's something I can manage later at a different time. But overall, I'm happy with how it turned out. And I'm really looking forward to starting on the jacket next time. See ya!